everybody. I'm Sheryl Grant. I'm Director of Digital Credentialing Strategies at Badgr, and I'm here today with Kerri Lemoie, Badgr's Director of Digital Credentials Research and Innovation, and we're here to talk about Open Badges 3.0, the new data standard on the horizon for open badges, and we're going to talk about what that means for you and your learners and your organization. And in today's webinar, not only are we going to talk about the technical implications of Open Badges 3.0 and the future of digital credentials, we're also going to ground these developments in some bigger human themes like trust, identity, and meaning. Because our hope is that regardless of what your technical proficiency might be, you can conceptualize what this new data standard means. So first, some housekeeping. Feel free to use the chat feature as one does. And if you want to ask any specific questions, please use the Q&A feature and we'll do our best to get to all of them. We're going to try and do it as we go so that those of you who have some in-context questions, I can't promise that. Depends on sort of how the conversation goes and how many questions we get, but we are going to set aside some time at the end of our conversation to make sure that we get to your questions, and hopefully we'll get to all of them. Jordana is here from Badgr and she is following along in the chat. So shout out and thank you to Jordana for her support today and for managing all your questions. And please say a warm welcome to Jordana as well. So hi, Kerri.
Hi, Sheryl. How's it going?
Pretty good. I was thinking about, I wrote a little bit about your bio as I was getting ready for this, and it reminded me at the earliest stages of my career, I had somebody in computer science who said, nobody will understand what I'm going to do for another 5 to 10 years. And I was thinking about that. Looking at your bio is stacked with so many concepts that are going to become new normals. So let me run through a little bit of your background for people so you have some understanding for those of you who are meeting Kerri for the first time, what her expertise is in. You're an expert in web technology, including decentralized technologies and standards like verifiable credentials and decentralized identifiers, which fortunately you're going to be talking about today. You're one of the founding technical contributors to Open Badges, and you're a leader in the education and workforce digital credentialing space. For those of you who were around in the early days of Open Badges, when Mozilla launched the standard, you'll recognize Kerri. She issued the very first version of the Open Badge standard to high school students after becoming a Badges for Lifelong Learning recipient in 2011, which is how Kerri and I met. And for the last decade, Kerri has been a longstanding contributor to the Open Badges standard and a very stalwart supporter of the Open Badges community and what that community stands for. And every iteration of Open Badges that exists, Kerri has been involved in and or led, including her seasoned leadership and expert direction, guiding the community as we round the corner on publishing the Open Badges 3.0 standard. So for those of you who work with micro-credentials or badges, but aren't as familiar with the work that goes into publishing data standards, this is work that's fundamental to how anything interoperable happens on the web. So I know sometimes coming into this work, especially if you're just working in the micro-credential space on the education side, some of these concepts can have a lot connected to them. So I just want to make sure that people understand that the data standards are a fundamental part of anything being interoperable on the web. All Open Badges are built on data standards, and for Open Badges to be interoperable and to work across the web, they have to originate with a set of shared standards. And that comes from a community of people like Kerri, like Badgr, organizations like Badgr that develop in a structured way, working on behalf of whatever vision they have for that standard. So the work that Kerri and others are doing is relevant to anyone issuing credentials as Open Badges. And right now, currently, most people are issuing Open Badges 2.0. So Kerri, let's go to you. Can you give us a high-level picture of what the changes are from Open Badges 2.0 to 3.0?
Yes, and actually before I do that, do you mind, since we have so many people on this webinar today, do you mind if we first just briefly talk about what Open Badges are? Because I think there are a lot of people who know what digital credentials are, and maybe even heard of micro-credentials and all of those, but don't exactly know what Open Badges is. So Open Badges is a standard. It is a standard at IMS Global that describes a single achievement. And how it works, what you may see is right now there's a badge image. And this badge image isn't just an image, isn't just like a sticker, a digital sticker. Instead, it has data associated with it. And that data describes the achievement. And it's an assertion of the achievement. So it describes who issued it, when it was issued, who it went to, and some description of what the achievement is and the criteria, any sort of standards alignment, and lots of times in some situations, evidence of that achievement. And so this standard's been around for about a little over a decade. And we're doing some work now to shift it to the next stage. So I guess this is where I can sort of talk about some of the high level stuff that we're gonna go over today. Is that good, Sheryl?
That sounds good. Yeah. And one thing I was thinking what we might do after this is if we get more questions than we can get to during this webinar, we may follow up and answer those questions in a blog that's connected to this webinar. So just in case a lot of people have very fundamental questions that we just go through so quickly, I just want to put that out there that I'm willing to do that so that we can answer people's questions and make sure everybody can follow along. So
I think that's a good idea. And also I see a lot of like familiar names in the chat as it goes through. So those of you who like want to discuss it in the chat, feel free and ask questions, because there are folks here who have a lot of knowledge who are part of this community too.
See, there's a sign of a seasoned leader. Get everybody else to do the work. You all can write the blog. Well, maybe we can then, after you've talked about what open badges are, maybe you can go and walk us through just a little bit of what has changed from 2.0 to 3.0, kind of a quick overview, and then we'll do a little redundancy in this webinar so we keep coming back to these themes.
Sure, that's great. I'm going to try and share my screen. I don't have very many slides today, but I have one or two just to sort of help. Okay, can you see my screen? See the slide up there? Great.
Yes.
Okay, so from a high level perspective, we're talking about adding verifiability, more learner identity and data agency to badges, and meaning, which you know, as we dig into this, you'll understand why that matters so much. From a verifiability perspective, we are aligning open badges with a W3C standard. W3C has been working on, if you don't know about them, they are the standard, like HTML standard. They are like the World Wide Web Consortium. They control and shepherd really all of the standards that are used online, or quite a few of them anyway, most of them. And there's a standard called verifiable credentials, and that is about how to verify documents online. So we're taking open badges and we're aligning with that. So we'll get into that a little bit today. We're also going to talk a little bit more about learner identity and data agency, about how learners can create their own identities. So more than just email, right? So we can add to that, and also about how they can use wallets and how like online, like wallets that are in their mobile phones or online, and how they can have more access, persistent access to their badges and store this information. And then also we'll be talking some about meaning. And this is about how we're going to be aligning with the comprehensive learning record and adding properties that can add more understanding to the data that I described that is in open badges.
Thank you for that, Kerri. And I think I forgot to mention that the recording is going to be available, and these slides will be in the recording. One of the things that we have talked about, Kerri and I have an opportunity to talk about all of this all the time. And one of the ways that I have used for myself to make sense of open badges is talking about trust. And I was studying trust and reputation systems prior to badges, and badges kind of floated right into that. And so one of the ways, because I don't have the same, and I'm assuming this is true for a lot of people in the micro-credential space, if you don't have the technical proficiency to understand some of these things, sometimes it's nice to have a frame that kind of gives you a touch point for a lot of these concepts. So I'm going to just talk very briefly about the way Kerri and I have these conversations around trust, and the changing ways, the shifting ways we negotiate trust online has really changed. There's a wonderful book written by Rachel Botsman that is not academic. It's written in a journalistic way. And I'd like to quote her. Her definition of trust is that it's a confident relationship with the unknown. But one of the things that I like about the way she sets up her work, and she's looking at reputation and trust online, and what she calls collaborative consumption, is that we have shifted from local trust to institutional trust, and we are undergoing this really pretty profound shift to distributed trust. And it changes the way that we do things and behave. And the distributed trust, the easiest way to communicate it is through Uber and Airbnb, and understanding that if you're staying in somebody's home, in a stranger's home, and you're paying for it, you are shifting and negotiating trust through an online platform. And same thing with Uber, you're getting to a car with a stranger and you're paying for that. And you're starting to shift over the ways in which you are negotiating trust through a technology platform. And we're doing this, not just Uber and Airbnb are the most common ones, but there are thousands and thousands of these platforms, everywhere from hiring nannies to TaskRabbit to, there's so many, it's hard to even mention all of them, but Airbnb and Uber are probably the most understandable. And so what we're watching with Open Badges is that a lot of these technologies that are starting to figure out how to keep, how to negotiate trust, not only negotiate trust, but how to maintain it online is also shifting. So Kerri, with that, maybe you can explain how Open Badges 3.0 are sort of part of this era of trust in the many different ways that they seem to be.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because we were sort of framing this discussion, we plan on framing it about trust, because we have entered this new paradigm. So thank you for sort of walking us through that. I mean, I think what, in addition to what you've been saying about how we've been using the internet differently and how technology has affected, how we perceive trust, is these additional layers of cryptography and encryption that are being included, that are being added to all websites, pretty much, right? All applications. It is very rare to see a website that is served without an SSL cert. And it's been since like 2018, Google started mandating that all websites have SSL certs. And if they don't, you often will see, you will see like, oh, this is not a secure site, right? So already we've been doing this. And what the SSL cert does is it says, this is like authenticates the identity of that website, right? So this is the identity, yeah. The authenticates the identity of the site, but it also serves the site encrypted. So that data is unreadable as it's being transmitted. And so I think what we're seeing with Open Badges and verifiable credentials is how do we adopt some of this technology so that Open Badges fits within this realm of security and privacy.
So one of the things that you and I have talked about that in my making sense of this shifts is the difference between hosting in the 2.0 standard and where we are going now, what exactly that meant in the 2.0 standard, and what could be different for us going forward.
Yeah, so badges for the most part are hosted on websites. And that makes them like human verifiable, but also they've been machine verifiable to the extent that the data that I described earlier, the JSON data, is findable. It is there and it can be read. And there is some verification that is described about that hosting, right? That it sits on that web server. So Open Badges have been able to be digitally signed all along, but not through like a globally adopted way. And so what we're looking at right now is using cryptography that is more globally being adopted as a way to digitally sign them, and actually moving away from the hosted verification. So it means that badges will still be human verifiable, still be able to share them online, just like most people do now, is really just share them online, share them on their LinkedIn profiles or social media, or even send them to people. You'll still be able to do that. But we're adding this additional layer that makes them more authenticatable and more tamper evident, and giving more control to learners using cryptography.
So I did see a comment fly by in chat that I wanted to catch, and I realized people are probably wondering, like, how exactly is this going to change any of their experience? So do you want to speak to that? When platforms become Open Badges 3.0 compliant, what does that mean for, and I think one of them was, I hope this doesn't change the way we share things to LinkedIn, I think was one of the comments. So maybe just a very brief thing about is this going to require people to do anything differently right away?
Right away, no. I mean, first of all, 2.0 badges and even previous versions of Open Badges will still be available. I mean, that has always been the case. So we've updated badges over the years, and no one has ever really seen the difference. So they're still going to be hosted online. You're still going to be able to share them online in the same way that you do. You can consider that 3.0 is adding an additional functionality to it. And I don't know if you want me to get into that now because it's a little bit of a description, but basically you'll be able to put your badges into wallets, right? And not all platforms will do this right away. At Badgr, we are talking about doing this, as soon as possible. And other platforms are discussing it too, but some Open Badges platforms will be operating exactly as they are now.
Well, I don't want to lose the thread of cryptography because I feel like that is a really core key, no pun intended,
Yes.
to a lot of this work. And I think even though we're familiar with SSL, maybe you can talk a little bit about how cryptography works online now, not just like what it is, but why now, and why are we trying to bring this into Open Badges and have it be consistent with other aspects of the web?
Yeah, I mean, there are different types of cryptography, but all of it is sort of based on this public key and private key methodology. And you can think about this as a public key being, say, the address to your home, and then the private key being the key to your house, right? And you wouldn't necessarily give that key to just anybody. In fact, maybe you would never give it to anyone because you don't want anyone to enter your house without you knowing. Public key and private keys work in that way with cryptography. So someone may know your public key, and then they don't know your private key. And what would happen is your identity or your badge could be signed with your private key, and then it can be verified with the public key. So, and then basically not verified. Instead, what I should say is that it can be proven that you are the one who signed it, that it was signed with your key. So that's how, so if I was to give you a badge that's signed by me with my private key, you would know that it was me giving it to you through the public key. I always have trouble explaining it. Every time I explain it, it comes out a little bit differently. So was that you think that was clear?
I feel like this is the kind of conversation for a lot of people you can explain twice, and each time you'll learn a little bit out of it. So if you feel like you want to continue to round that out, feel free to go ahead, or we can jump into another question.
Well, why don't we move on and we'll come back around to it. Sure, it will be tied in again. So
I know there's a really interesting connection between cryptography, Open Badges 3.0, authenticity and identity. So maybe you could describe cryptography specifically from the Open Badges 3.0 perspective.
Yeah. All right. So let's just walk through the meat of how all of this works, right? I'm going to give an example of how one way it could be implemented. Consider that an issuer would be represented by a decentralized identifier. And decentralized identifiers are identifiers that can be created by individuals that are associated with the public and private keys. And that's how the authenticity of those identities are authenticated. There's a lot of different decentralized identifiers, a whole different ways of doing that. But let's just say that is one way. That is a decentralized identifier. So a badging platform could have a decentralized identifier associated with the issuer. And then what would happen is that a badge could be issued, say, to the learner, right? And then they would have a wallet and a wallet application, and they would create their own DID using that wallet. And then they would request that badge be issued to that DID. Then what would happen is that once it's accepted in their wallet, that data that we spoke of before that comprises an open badge would be signed by the issuer at the time it was issued, so that if data was changed at all, the verifier would be able to tell, right? So it's tamper evident in that way. So the signing of the badge data makes it tamper evident, but also the verifier would be able to tell, authenticate that it was that issuer that signed it. On the same end, the verifier would be able to tell that it was the learner that would be presenting it to them in the wallet. And so this is a little bit different than somebody posting their badge to somebody or emailing their badge to someone and then someone going to look at it. Because what we're sort of talking about more so is machine verification, where it might be an application that asks a learner to upload their badge to the system, and then the system is able to cryptographically verify all of this. So in this way, we're looking at the data being used more in that way versus a human verifiable way.
Yeah, one of the things I think when we've talked before that you had said to me is that email addresses were never meant to be associated with identity at the beginning of the internet, and that we have sort of inherited that as a legacy, and this is kind of a correction to that. Is that sort of a accurate way to say it?
Yeah, it's an attempted correction of that. That's what people are hoping, right? There was never a human identity layer added to the internet because it just wasn't thought of at the beginning. I was actually having a conversation with someone this week about that. And because that didn't exist, we used whatever was available to us. Email addresses are, somewhat verifiable because you can respond to an email, but you never know who's responding. There are times where I've issued badges in the past to an email address and found out that several people use that email address. And also, you don't own your email addresses, even if you own the server that your email address is being used on. So I have KerriLemoie.com, and I may have Kerri at KerriLemoie.com, but I rent KerriLemoie.com from a domain name service. And if I don't pay for it, then I will lose that email address. And the same goes if you're using employer's email or sometimes an institution email.
So I'm trying to imagine, maybe this is getting a little bit too much toward the use case of this, but it sounds like what is also happening with Open Badges 3.0 is preparing for a much more normalized world in which we use wallets.
Yeah,
so,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I know that there's some discussion about whether the email address is associated with the DID or the wallet, but it could be that we start to identify each other in terms of DIDs, in order to transmit data.
Yeah, if DIDs get adopted, it will be some time before that happens. We're going to be using emails. We're going to be using federated identities from services like Google and Twitter or in Facebook. But hopefully over time, this does work. I mean, I did mention that there are a lot of decentralized identifiers now, and it remains to be seen which ones will bubble up and be the ones that people use the most. So keeping in mind that this is a very early stage. So this is why, in the Verifiable Credentials for Education Task Force, we talk a lot about bridging and making sure that what exists now continues to exist as we make efforts towards this future world. And the great thing about decentralized identifiers is that we can create them, right? They'll be ours. We can decide what to use them for. We can decide to switch what decentralized identifiers we use for things. So in many ways, it'll allow us to navigate the web more securely and privately. It'll just be some time before it really catches on.
Yeah, but I have to say I am surprised at how quickly things do catch on that at one moment may seem so foreign, and then the next thing you know, if it's something that is going to keep people feeling confident and trustworthy, or that they will trust something online, I think the adoption will move more quickly.
Yeah, I mean, Microsoft has been heavily involved in all of this work. They have their own DID called DID-ION, and they're doing a lot of work in this effort. So I think you're going to see it moving more in that direction anyway.
So maybe the thing to do now is to get into some of the specifics. I know we're starting to get some questions that are driving towards specifics, but maybe you can talk about what people need to know right now. Like the functionality and
I mean, right now what is happening is that the standard Open Badges 3.0 is being worked on at IMS Global. And we are working on, the members at IMS Global are working on how to align this, right, with verifiable credentials. And so that's taking some work right now. And then also there is work going out, the comprehensive learning record work group, to actually also align with verifiable credentials and align those achievement models. And this is where we're sort of talking about the meaning, right? Adding more understanding to what these credentials are. I mean, for those of you who aren't familiar with this, earlier I said open badges are a single achievement. They represent one achievement, but a comprehensive learning record is much more complex. So it's going to take a bit to figure that out, because a CLR is could be a transcript, right? You can imagine how complex a transcript could be. So that's we're working on that right now at BC Edu, which is at W3C. It's a task force that's sort of examining how this work is happening in all the education data standards and how they are aligning. It's going to serve as sort of the central resource for all of this work, right? Because it's not just IMS Global Standard that's doing its other standards too. So that's being worked on too. And so in their recommendation, probably all of this will sort of culminate maybe like later this spring, where folks can start piloting. I think there's some like little piloting going on right now. I'm messing around with like a little demo app right now. So that's the stage that we're really at. So really what people can do right now is really just sort of focus on their badge designs, just like they always have been, and their badging systems, and just, you know, keep that focus going. And we'll keep updating folks on progress.
And I know you had said to me that the badges are still going to be shareable. They're still going to have images. They're still going to have metadata. Is there anything that will be added to the metadata that people might want to know about?
Yeah, one thing about images, and this is something that's still being discussed, but images with open badges have always been integral to what they are, because the data has been baked into the images. So we say baked like a digital photograph has data inside of it, right? Open badge work that way too, except that in 3.0, a badge image will actually be optional. So that's very interesting, because you can think about more of the data being transmitted, less so than the image. Although many platforms, including ours, will have images still, I'm sure, because they're enjoyable to look at and they're easier to understand online, right? But other information that we're looking at adding, one is achievement type. This is a property that comes from the CLR. And this is so that we can identify an open badge specifically as something like a certification or a diploma, right? And these properties, I think, are going to align with what's going on at Credential Engine. And they have the credential transparency description language that describes different types of achievements. So we are trying to sort of align with them so that we have that interoperability. And this way, we very much can say, oh, this open badge is a diploma. This open badge is a certification. This open badge is just a badge, right? And we can describe the different things. So I think that's some of the primary things that we're working on. There are some other changes that are being considered, such as the differentiating between a creator and the issuer. So that's being discussed. It's been a long time discussion in the open badges community. We haven't quite gotten to that yet in the working group.
Can you give us an example of what that would look like?
Yeah, I think this is a good example. I always use this one, which is like the Red Cross. You know, the Red Cross in the United States, I think it's just the United States organization, has, certifications that we're all very familiar with, first aid, CPR, but they're taught in schools, at churches, and all over the place. So it could be that Red Cross is the creator of these credentials, but that the school system is the issuer of it.
I'm sure
there's way more complex examples, but that's one I could think of.
I saw in chat somebody said yay about the achievement type. So it's so nice to get enthusiasm about stuff that you probably feel has taken a long time to work towards. So I wanted to make sure that you know that there are some clapping out there for that.
I've been hearing that a lot, and it's something we talked about in open badges a long time ago, and it got we just couldn't get to it, I think. When we've been talking about trust in this conversation, and I think adding meaning also contributes to trust of open badges. But I also think it's key to adoption, right? If one of the considerations of open badges over the years is, oh, there's all these badges. What does this data mean? How do we understand it? So if we start moving in that direction, like we are with the Open Skills Network, right, and the rich skill descriptors and Credential Engine and the work they're doing, we might move towards some more understanding, right, to increase adoption.
Yeah, and it's an interesting cart before horse type of conversation, because I know for myself, from a technology perspective, watching and looking at adoption, that a lot of the conversation we have around the value proposition, some of it is going to get picked up by the technology when these pieces start to feel like they're making meaning on their own at scale and more efficiently than as effectively that's happened before. So there is this sense that we have to find value in these sort of more traditional ways, like waiting for an employer to recognize that it means something. And I think it's a sign a little bit that the trust piece has not risen high enough, and the meaning has not risen to the threshold that people are expecting in order for some of this technology to show what is self-evident to us, but is not yet. It's just not quite there. So when I look at the transition of open badges, to me, honestly, it's a social innovation miracle. The fact that this got as far as it did with no technology there. I mean, really, the 0.5 standard was so basic, and there was no proof of concept, and we got, I mean, more of a response, I think, than I'm sure a lot of people knew there was going to be a response, but it ripped like wildfire through the education space and then the employment space. So I'm hoping that, and I think at the beginning of this, I said somebody wrote to comment, Simone wrote to say that this is the most important thing since open badges. And I think there's an element of truth to that this trust piece, once it is proof of concept and it's starting to generate meaning, I think I do think that it's going to do something to allow for us to not lean so heavily on some of these high touch things we do, like employer engagement.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, a long time ago, there was this group that I was involved in called Badgr Director, and we were talking about the verifiability of badges and what role they might play in that trust, right? That what role they might play in being adopted. I think you're right. To a certain extent, we are still putting a lot of focus on creating the technology and getting them issued and designing them, and even still more so than ever, we need to start getting the consumption considerations taken into consideration at the design level, right? And that's where we're going to increase understanding and meaning and adoption. And so hopefully a combination of all of this will help with that.
Yeah. And I do want to start turning over to some of the questions in the Q&A, primarily because Kerri said somebody's going to ask something about blockchain, and ding, 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 you were correct. We have a question here from Claudine, which is about the trust layer. Is the trust layer underpinned by blockchain technology? And then I'm not sure what this second part of the question is, trust over IP.
Oh, yes. So no. So let's start with blockchain first. Because I know, so let's start there, because that is the question. When are badges going to be on blockchain? So there is a way to put badges on blockchain now. It's called block certs, and it's an open source system, and you can go and do that. But verifiable credentials, which is the standard that we're using with open badges, right? And blockchains have the same underlying technology, which is cryptography. So we can issue verifiable credentials with decentralized identifiers that can be cryptographically verified and tamper evident without having to put it on a public blockchain or even a private blockchain. Blockchains are these ledgers are intended to be also tamper evident and immutable, but you don't need to store data there. Right? It doesn't add any value to this, really. Where blockchain does add value, though, is at the decentralized identity layer. So there are decentralized identifiers that don't require blockchain, but there are some that use blockchain. And what happens is that these identities are anchored in blockchain, and then they can be used in other places. And that makes more sense. So I think Yeah, we get asked a lot at Badgr, like, when are we doing blockchain badges? And I just sort of would shift that to say, when are we doing more verifiable badges, and where is blockchain in that story is with the decentralized identity. And trust over IP, I know a little bit about that, and I believe it's just a set of protocols to do this kind of work, and where this is being discussed. And there's some pretty big players involved in this space, and they're probably going to actually push a lot of this forward. But I don't know, I can't speak to it very well here.
So is it fair to say that when we start thinking about blockchain, Open Badges 3.0, some of these other, what feels like the most secure? What is the most trustworthy? Is it a sort of a trade-off between security and ease of use? Is there any of those factors involved in trying to weigh the differences between when to use blockchain, when to use? Does that question make sense?
Yes. Well, so with open badges, what's going to happen when we start integrating with the wallets are going to make some decisions about what decentralized identifiers they're going to use. And that's how I think the market will drive this, right? When the Apple wallet starts deciding which decentralized identifiers to use, will they be blockchain related? Probably. I think somebody mentioned Kerri in the chat, and there are ways to use decentralized identifiers that make a lot of sense, right? That you should, like, and so that you can, rotate them and manage them and replace them, and that kind of thing. So it makes sense to look at blockchain there. And then otherwise we're really just looking at, I think, cryptography, right? And the cryptography has been around forever on the internet, and I think that's where we're going to be leading more so. Did my answer make sense, Cheryl?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of people, once there is an example that they're working with, they'll be able to sort of sort this out. But what I take from your answer is that it's not really that blockchain is compared to Open Badges 3.0 is compared to something else. It's that they all are serving the same function, which is to increase the way we negotiate trust online.
Yeah, and keep in mind, like, today what I'm describing is like really like structural level stuff, right? Most of us don't even experience this. We're going to be using apps that have implemented this. I think it's important for people to understand it, but I don't think it's something that it's early. It's early. All of this is very early. But yes, I think that's a good way to say it, Cheryl.
And one of the things that I think about is, it's in commerce's interest to maintain trust online.
Mm-hmm.
And like a lot of things, it's coming to education a little bit behind. So some of what's happening is that we're starting to harness these technologies for education, for employment, the talent pipeline, if you want to call it that. So some of it is just open badges are making sure that we are in lockstep with things that are coming from the W3 consortium and verifiable credentials.
Yeah, and you know what, before I get to this, I should have said, there are things like, and I don't really want to get into this today, so I'm afraid to mention it, but there are things like NFTs that are out there. Cheryl's laughing, I think, because we were like, let's not bring up this topic. And there are things being used in ways that I wouldn't recommend right now, because open badges do actually have this structure that are feeding what is going on right now. The verifiable credentials are part of that too. The skills-based hiring, for instance, like we're hearing a lot about skills-based hiring, and I love that, because that is sort of, I think, come out of this movement to an extent, right? We've helped. So not only has it like badges provide this technology, but also we have instilled a sort of a philosophy of sorts. And now we're talking about how skills we learn every day are useful, that we don't always need degrees for everything. And I think that is, that's great.
Okay, I'm going to try to stay focused on the Q&A, or the questions that our guests are asking. There's one question here from Jan. Will there be, again, an open source server for Open Badges 3 by Badgr?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not really on the team that decides those things, so I don't know.
We encourage you to go to info.badgr.com to scroll down, and there's a place where you can sign up for a newsletter if you want to get updates on product releases and future webinars, and when Kerri and I get around to writing a blog to answer some of the questions. So that's a good place to make sure that you stay abreast of that information. Here's a question from Stella. Will these changes increase digital divide because not all people will have or know how to manage these verifiable identities and adoption of wallets? Do you see Open Badges 3.0 changing the divide at all?
I think that's a very valid question that has to be discussed, and it is a topic at BC Edu as well. And there are already wallets that are looking at how do you use different systems to make it more accessible. For instance, paper processes even, all right, paper processes with QR codes that tie to other systems. I gave you an example of verifiable credential as a badge being transferred to a wallet very specifically, but verifiable credentials are used in all sorts of ways. It's really just much like Open Badges. It's a data model, and it can be used from system to system and in other ways. So hopefully it doesn't. I mean, the goal is not to increase any more of the digital divide and to make it as accessible as possible. And, that's we're working on that for sure. We can't really do anything about people not having access, and there are initiatives like Digital Promise and others that are trying to address, some of those inequities in technology. I have all sorts of opinions about that, and hopefully we do good here.
Yeah, we think about this a lot in our work, and so it's a great question. It has to be asked in every webinar. It really does, to keep it front and center. Noah asked a question, and I'm just going to paraphrase it, but well, no, I'm not. It's a great question. I'll just read the whole thing. As someone who gets easily excited about things, I'm curious if you are seeing people get excited about anything to do with verifiable credentials, decentralized identity, next-gen Open Badge functionalities in ways that make you suspect that some people here may not realize what's already in production versus what's maybe not even yet into staging. So I think the question is there something that's actually ready for people to start using anywhere connected to this, or is it still kind of in the data standards stage?
No, this is very early, and it's awesome that there is so much interest at this stage. It is very early. Hopefully by, I would say around June or so, we will see some pilots, and then it will go on from there. Yeah, so it's very early. There's so much buzz about this, though. I mean, if you look at learning and employment records, you're going to see verifiable credentials mentioned, and you're going to see that some big foundations and employers and associations like the Chamber of Commerce Foundation and T3 Innovation Network, they are very busy thinking about all of this. So there's a lot of, I would say, a lot of energy surrounding this.
I would agree with that. And I would say too, that there's also in adjacent sectors like healthcare. I don't know if people had been in the webinar with one of our colleagues from SNU. She was talking about going to the Cayman Islands and had been asked to show digitally her proof of vaccination. So there is some movement in other sectors that I think is generating some of this excitement also.
Where there is something, it's not in education where it's being used, but proof of age. I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the organization, but it is has to do with convenience stores and people using verifiable credentials to prove that they are old enough to buy alcohol in that state. And the Department of Homeland Security has been doing a whole bunch of work in this regard too, and leading competitions and projects in interoperability that is worth looking into. And all of that is informing the work in education, because a lot of these discussions are happening at the credentials community group at the W3C, where the Verifiable Credentials for Education Task Force is a part of, right? So we are all working together on these things. So we're informing, our use cases inform that work, and their work is informing our implementations.
Here's a good question too, and I think you addressed this, but I like the way this question's phrased. I think it'll draw out a very specific response. Will the Open Badges 3.0 change enhance the relationship between digital badges and associated skills?
Oh yeah, we didn't talk about skill assertions yet with Open Badges 3.0, so I think this ties to that. So what is that? Open Badges already can have alignments to skills. That is already part of the standard and already being done on plenty of platforms. But one of the things being discussed at Open Badges 3.0 working group is how to do single skill assertions. So if you didn't think a badge was small enough, now we're talking about assertions for actual just single skills. And those would be tied to rich skill descriptors. So there would actually be no description, no criteria, no badge image. It would just be an assertion of a skill. And that's a really interesting proposition, right? How could those be combined and stacked into in other ways by learners? So that's something that's also being looked into that I'm particularly very excited about.
And if you want to learn more about rich skill descriptors, you could go to OSN, the Open Skills Network, and you can join working groups and start following that work too, because that is another piece of the ecosystem that is definitely growing up with Open Badges.
Yeah, and I have a resources slide, and I should have added that to it, but we can provide a link. But really, if you look up a rich skill descriptors or Open Skills Network, you will find information on that pretty easily. Thank you, Val.
Yeah, thanks, Val, for putting that link in the chat. And this is I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Michelle. Will it be possible to change badges issued in the 2.0 standard to badges in the 3.0 standard?
Maybe. Some platforms will do that. That's something we've talked about. So yeah, possibly.
And I really like this is this is coming from Justin, not necessarily a question, but I think this is worth talking about. Not a question, but a concern. With a greater emphasis on data and machine readability, can I expect all of my badges or micro-credentials to eventually form a sort of competency profile about me? Can the quantifiable aspects of my badges and network be reduced to competency numbers? I wonder about the impacts of that. I think that's an interesting privacy, security, trust question also.
Yes, I mean, people often wonder if this does Open Badges and verifiable credentials do anything for controlling data with bigger systems. I mean, to a certain extent, it can give you more control because you don't have to share that data. But like we've been talking about, trust and platforms, if you choose to share your data with the system, you're hoping that they're going to do good things with it. And it's hard to know this, right? And most people don't even read privacy or privacy policies or terms of service, and haven't been, because they're willing to give their data away for free use. And hopefully we see different models for this. I mean, we're not talking about being able to solve this with verifiable credentials, but it should, just like the access question, accessibility and all, we should be talking about it. So I'm glad that Justin brought it up.
Yeah, I think one of the great shocks for me, I come out of a library and information science background. One of the great shocks for me is that the market research on you by zip code prior to all the data that has been gathered about you was already pretty creepy. I mean, just even pre-data, pre-Google, pre-mobile phones tracking everything. I mean, it was already pretty disturbing. You can identify yourself by zip code in a way that you might not have already, and the librarians were using that to build collections of books. So they were good actors in that space, but that information was already pretty specific to your preferences and things like that. And it's only gotten more so, but it's a thing that predates in many ways the pervasiveness of the internet in our lives. But it's a good question, because one of the things I had hoped for with the wallet is that there would be some curation better curation in terms of what I would allow to be seen or not seen in an employment perspective.
Well, I mean, it remains to be seen what wallet functionality will be. Also, you can consider that you may issue your verifiable credentials to other systems, and because they will provide different functionalities for it. Man, I think we know that there's so much bias in AI, and we know that these things are happening. And yeah, I'm curious to see what wallets will do and how they could help us in that regard. It may be an opportunity there for sure.
And do you have any suggestions for how people can get involved to understand wallets? It seems like this is sort of it dovetails a little bit with Open Badges 3.0 in terms of actually grasping something that can be investigated now.
I'm going to just sort of name some wallets, not out of any preference per se, just because they're coming to mind. But there is the Matter wallet, which is spelled MATTR, that you could look at. I think you can just get it out of the Apple Store now. And then also the Digital Credential Consortium has been working on the Learner wallet. And I believe that is also available in the Apple Store. Probably both of them are available, Apple and Android. I'm pretty sure they both are. So one thing is to sort of download them and try them out and see what they have in there. Hopefully we will have a demo soon that will sort of show, and the example that I explained about putting a badge in a wallet. And I think there are other systems who are working on those pilots. So in the short term, I think that's where I would start. I mean, if you start Googling verifiable credential wallets, you will see that there's a lot of information out there. And like we had talked about, like in adjacent spaces, there are wallets being used. There's also an article out there I read not that long ago about Apple, the Apple wallet taking on verifiable credentials at some point. So that is also cool, right?
There's a comment from Kevin, and Kevin, feel free to include what you shared with me in Q&A if you haven't done in the chat, that the examples of education using DIDs and BCs today, they're not badges or CLRs, comprehensive learner records, but they're examples of how people are using it today. So anything that I think helps this community get a sense of utility and how it's being implemented, I think is helpful. I think there's a learning curve for a lot of people, even those of us who've been in the space for a really long time.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks for sharing that.
I meant to share this sooner. This is some resources. It's a small list. I know I see what time we're at, and there's going to be more webinars as this work increases and we get closer. We'll be able to describe it in even better detail and have examples for you. We're going to write about it a bunch. So stay tuned, really. You consider this sort of an introductory conversation, right, Cheryl? Would you say that's true?
I think it's true. And for anybody who is brand new to micro-credentials or open badges, woo, if you hung in here till the end, you are. Yeah. If you are brand new and you're trying to make sense of this, I highly encourage you. One of the things that is so great about this work now, 10 years after we started it, is that you can actually just get hands-on experience through the Badgr platform. You can go to the info.badgr.com and I think if you click, I think it's talk to sales, you can set up a demo. We have a great team who shows what all the functionality is so that you don't have to guess at this. Some of what we're talking about today is very abstract. So it's nice to get something concrete that you can see and begin to sort of visualize for your institution. And then it sounds like one of the other things to do is start playing around with wallets if you haven't already. If you've used your Apple Wallet, I think you're halfway there. There are some other examples that are it's designed so people are going to come up with different ways to make it user-friendly and have other features. So it's nice to test as many as you can. I just went to one, I think is it Gattaca.io coming out?
Oh yes, Gattaca, they're out in the EU. Right? That's where they've been working in the EU identity space and also in education. Yes.
And I think Sharon Liu at JFF is doing a lot of work around wallets. I don't know if you know what the status of that work is, but learning about that, I think, is going to sort of help fill out some of this, the big question mark around Open Badges 3.0. I do have a couple other questions. I know we're winding down for time, but I thought we could just squeeze in as many as possible. Are there any accessibility considerations or enhancements in Open Badges 3.0?
Not that we've discussed yet. I mean, there is a way to for language internationalization already. In verifiable credentials for education task force, VC Edu, we are talking about that more. So and those will be aligned. So there's some discussions happening there.
And I
very
want
early.
Kerri has done this for me, and I have tried to participate as much as possible. But the W3C BC Edu task force is anybody can join, anybody can listen. You can listen quietly and lurk, which is what I tend to do. And it does seem like over time there is some osmosis, and you start picking up this. And you'll recognize in these conversations that it's very philosophical. Sometimes people are fighting over principles and ideals and representations or use cases and things like that. So if you really love this work and you want to be involved at a direction level, that it's a community that's very welcoming, and I think it's Kerri. Are you still the?
Yeah, I'm one of the co-chairs, and also, yeah, like Sheryl said, we're welcome anybody, even if you're just learning or you're just in education and you want to understand technology better. I have no technology background at all. We need your input. Right, we're actually running use cases right now that are relative, like to any kind of credential, and also it's free to join. It's open, and all of the meetings are recorded and archived, so you could look through the history and see what we've been working on. And we have a public mailing list where you can ask questions. So this is where we're working out in the open on this.
Yeah, we're working on it in the open, and it's also, to me, I think it's one of the reasons why Kerri and I found ourselves wanting to be part of the Badgr team, is because investing in this at the level that we are, with Kerri leading a lot of this and authoring a big chunk of this and guiding this community, is because we want to see this in the ecosystem. We feel like it's really important that people who are using our system, even if they don't understand Open Badges 3.0, that we are bringing some of what the rest of the web is doing, and elevating that level of trust and utility that I think is going to, just like I was experiencing with my colleague at the beginning of my career, that some of this stuff we're talking about now won't make sense to a lot of people, but it is going to become normal. It's everywhere on the web, and it's starting to come here, and we want to be right at the tip of the spear for that, so that the people using Open Badges have some of this utility to just to make the experience better.
Yeah, and I know we're at time, but throughout the years, Nate Otto and Wayne have really made sure that we have participated out in the Open Recognition Alliance, and now even with the Open Recognition Group at the Open Skills Network. So we really are trying to work out in the open as much as possible, because we believe in that, right? We believe in community sourced technology, because it's better and safer, for real.
So I wanted to thank everybody. It is now 2:00. People are probably getting ready to go to their next meeting. Thank you so much for showing such a great, just to have so many people show up for this tells us that this is something that people are really ready to hear about. And so thank you for taking a precious hour of your day I can't wait to go through the chat and see what everybody was talking about. Kerri, thank you so much. You and I have such great conversations about this. So it really was a delight to be able to share this with the rest of the community.
Thank you, Sheryl. I'm really glad we get to work together on these things. And yeah, thanks everybody for being here today and for your support. More soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.